Hey, Science 20s, it's time to talk about round 2 of Darwin's theory of evolution. Okay, so Darwin realized on this crazy trip that he went on, and I've got a video for his crazy trip and more details if you want to watch it. It's in the notes this week, that these finches he was looking at started to differentiate because they had different types of food on their island. They eventually became different species. Now, based on these observations, along with other really cool observations, like, for example, on one of the islands in the Galapagos, the cactus had soft needles. And on another island, they had the same type of looking cactus had spiky needles. And it was very puzzling. Why did one of the islands have cactus with spiky needles and the other one didn't? Well, when Darwin and his team took more and more observations, they found that on the island with the spiky needles, there was iguana, like one of these. There are these crazy reptiles that swim. They're aquatic iguanas, these lizards, would try to eat the cactus. And on the other island, these iguanas weren't there. So the cactus, over time, had to develop a defense mechanism to keep these iguanas from eating the cactus completely gone. Okay, now, here are the 3 conclusions from all of the different observations that Darwin came up with for natural selection. The first one is organisms produce more offspring than can survive. So everything in nature has more babies or makes more copies of itself than there is resources for it to survive. And while I don't want to use humans as an example, you only have to look back a couple hundred years to the size of families that humans had. You know, part of it is education, part of it is birth control, but part of it is that you needed to have lots of kids because invariably many of them would die. It's terrible, but hundreds and hundreds of years ago, a lot of kids would die before they reached 2. That was actually the infant mortality rate was really horrific. Now things have changed with humans. Obviously, we have better health systems, sanitation, education, and birth control. But you really only have to look back 100 years in Canada to see that the family size was a lot bigger. And you look back further than that, it was even larger. Anyways, now, every time offspring are created, they're a little bit different from the parents because of either sexual reproduction, where you have different genetic traits that are mixed, or tiny changes in genetic code called mutations. And when there is a competition for limited resources, the animal that is best suited, that has the traits that allow it to survive, will then survive and pass on those traits. Now, it's a common misconception where it's stated that the theory of evolution or natural selection is the strongest will survive. And that's not true. You could be a very strong, huge animal, like we've already talked about, like the short-faced bear, and you will go extinct immediately if you're not suited to the resources that is in your ecosystem. Sometimes it's the smartest animal. Sometimes it is the animal with the best ways to reproduce. Sometimes it's not the strongest. If you go back in time with humans, there's a really fascinating tree of life we're going to look at tomorrow. But humans had many other early human type primates that were on the same Earth at the same time as our early ancestors that we came from. And anthropologists have kind of figured out that our ancestors probably survived for a couple reasons. One, we were a little bit smarter. The brain to body ratio was a bit better for our early ancestors. And 2, our early ancestors were super violent and way more willing to be tribal, like protect a small group, than the other Neanderthals at the time. So that was what allowed humans to survive, and that might explain why our species has some very violent tendencies, and there's things such as, prejudice and racism, because our early ancestors weren't super trustworthy of people that weren't part of their close-knit community. Now, that's hopefully that will change in the future, because that was maybe back in the day you were worried about another tribe taking your resources, but now we don't have to worry about that as much, because we're more civilized, right? There's no need to have that anymore. Racism and prejudice is stupid. Okay. Now, Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection caused a big backlash, and there's still backlash to this day. People are very upset to think that humans at one time, be changed, and we weren't created as we look like right now. And while I sympathize with people that have a belief system like that, the evidence isn't there. The evidence isn't even debated anymore. It's a fact that humans have a common ancestor with all of the other primates on Earth. Now, Darwin wasn't the first to see that animals change over time. There was another very famous scientist called Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. We might get to talk about him tomorrow. But Darwin was the first one to kind of put everything together. He had a lot of money. He came from a very, very wealthy family. So he was able to afford this extravagant trip. He went to the Galapagos Islands. And when he suggested that all animals perhaps had a common ancestor, people, when he started talking about humans, that was a big deal. People didn't care, like, oh, this dog has a common ancestor of a wolf. People are like, whatever, it's a dog. But as soon as he started talking about humans, it was a bit of a problem. And that backlash lasted for a long time. Darwin didn't get everything right. It's not like we haven't changed some of his ideas. He was wrong about a bunch of stuff. But the evidence and the overwhelming scientific data and reams of fossils show that animals do have common ancestors. In fact, it's the bedrock of biology. You cannot be a biologist if this is something that you don't agree with. So yeah, nothing makes sense without it. The amount of evidence that supports this is so overwhelming that the scientists debate the nuance of it. They don't debate that it's true or not. And it's the founding principle of biology. Everything from genetics to ecology to medicine has a bedrock in evolution. Now, the great question, and this is a great one for people who maybe some of you are religious, maybe some of you like philosophy, maybe some of you guys like thinking of the big picture, is biologists and scientists can't answer the question where life originated from. We can only go back in time so far. We get to like bacteria, right? We get to single-celled organisms, and there's great stretches of time where we don't have fossils because there weren't animals with bones. And before there were bacteria, scientists are still trying to figure out how life on Earth got started. There are a lot of really amazing ideas. And maybe that's the realm where people who are quite religious can keep their beliefs. Maybe there was a supreme deity that got life started on Earth. We don't know. That question hasn't been answered yet, but scientists are trying to answer that. So hopefully if that is answered, it doesn't cause people to, have a big backlash, because scientists are actually actively trying to solve that. There's a really cool theory called panspermia, where life maybe came to Earth from somewhere else in the universe, right? Bacteria can survive perhaps frozen on a meteor, frozen on a comet that crashed into Earth. Perhaps that's how life maybe got to Earth to Mars, or from Mars to Earth. Okay. So we're going to talk about the tree of life. We're going to talk about the tree of life tomorrow. I just need to exit this. And I'm going to show you guys this really fun, nope, not that. I'm going to show you guys this really fun little demo about how natural selection and evolution works. So this is a rabbit. Now if I press go, Okay, so the rabbit's going to hop around. He's a good little rabbit. Okay, right, there's a rabbit. Now, that rabbit's not going to be able to have babies because this rabbit doesn't have a friend. Quote unquote friend. So let's add a mate for the rabbit. Oh, there's a rabbit. Now there's two rabbits. Look at them go. They're so cute. And then, as rabbits do, they get jiggy with it. And they have bubbies, and rabbits rapidly produce. Rapidly produce. And that's one of their advantages is rabbits can have a huge litter of babies. I don't know what they're called, kits, I think. And they can have multiple pregnancies in a year. So the problem is that if you have unlimited resources, the rabbits are going to continue to reproduce until bunnies have taken over the world. Okay, so we're going to play again. I'm going to add a friend. Now, there's also no limited resources, and there's also there's nothing that's like hunting down the rabbits. Now, the problem is that if we introduce something like a wolf, here comes the wolves. All right, and they didn't eat all the rabbits. Maybe the rabbits will be able to reproduce quick enough to feed the wolves. We'll see here, because here comes the wolves. Oh, things are not looking good for the rabbits. Hey, that's really bad. So when natural selection occurs, I think okay, I'm going to add a mutation for brown fur. So that means some of the babies will be born with brown fur. And as you can see, they were left alone by the wolves because they're harder to see on the brown grass. Now, eventually, this happened super quickly actually, there are no more white rabbits left. This environment wasn't a good environment for rabbits that are white. Now, if I change it, we've just screwed over all of those brown rabbits because now the wolves can easily see them, right? The wolves can easily see them. If we make them compete for food, and I take away, and we'll turn it back to the equator, if we make the rabbits compete for food, only a certain amount of rabbits are going to survive, right? So there's only a certain amount of food for the rabbits. They'll have babies, and there's limited resources, so some of them starve to death. Now, let's add long teeth. A long teeth means that maybe those rabbits, you probably see the snaggly toothed ones. The long toothed rabbits might have an advantage to eat the food over, see how there's more snaggly toothed rabbits now? So that's how selective pressures of predators or food can change an animal. Now, the tails don't do anything. Sometimes there are structural adaptations, not structural adaptations. Sometimes there are structures on the body of animals that actually doesn't do anything. It kind of leapfrogs with the DNA. It doesn't help them survive. It's just there, right? So now we got lots of rabbits, but there's not a lot of food. So they'll starve to death. It looks like the snaggly tooth. Oh my goodness, there's so many of them. Anyways, so that's a little demo that shows you a little bit about natural selection and evolution.